Let's call the meeting of the Environment and Natural Resources Committee to order. Brian, is it easiest to do a roll call? Would that be for the attendees?
Yeah, I think we can do what we've done the last couple of months, which is we'll do a roll call and I can read off the names, and we'll do that in conjunction with voting on the minutes from the September meeting. So I'll call your name, and if you could say that you're here and also whether you approve the September minutes.
Sounds good. Are there any agenda changes or announcements, Brian?
Not from us.
Okay, great. Any announcements or from anyone else? All right, hearing none, let's move on then. Approval of the minutes from the September 3rd meeting. Do a roll call vote.
Great, okay. Jack Darren.
Here, good morning.
Hi, Jack. And do you have a vote on approving the September minutes as well?
Oh, I'm sorry, guys. I just joined. I had a hard time tracking down this link. Yes, I approve.
Thank you. Sean Wydell.
Here and yes.
Lindsay Burt. Carrie Cragen.
Present, and I approve.
Martha Dooley.
Here and yes.
Great. Aaron Dernbaugh. Elena Grossman. Andrew Hawkins.
Here and I approve.
Paul May. Stacy Myers.
Here.
Hi, Stacy. And do you have a vote on the September minutes?
I was just looking to make sure that I was actually there. And I believe the answer is yes from what I'm seeing. Approve.
Great, thank you. Ted Penesis.
Present, and I approve.
Tom Rickert.
Here and yes.
Vanessa Ruiz. Deborah Stone.
Here and yes.
And Mike Warner.
Mike Priscilla for Lake County Stormwater Management, and yes.
Great, thank you all.
Great, thanks everyone. So the next agenda item is moving Will County. We've got Jackie Hendrickson from Civil Tech and Farat Zarin from Ginkgo.
Sorry, Sean, before we get to that presentation, we're going to do the meeting schedule for 2021.
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed that one. Sorry about that. Apologies. Go for it, Brian.
Thanks. So we were planning on sticking with the same basic schedule for 2021 that we've been using for the past couple of years, which is to meet on the first Thursday at 9:30 a.m. and to use the each alternate month. So it would be January, March, May, July, September, and November. And there are no wrinkles from holidays next year, which I think is a first for us. So we don't run into the 4th of July or anything like that. So we were going to propose meetings at 9:30 on the GoToMeeting platform, January 7th, March 4th, May 6th, July 1st, September 2nd, and November 4th.
Perfect. Thanks, Brian. I would entertain a motion to approve the meeting schedule for 2021.
Moved.
Tom Rickert, second.
Thank you, Tom. And Stacy, was that you who moved? Or was that Deb?
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Stacy. All right, all in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? I presume none. None. All right, great. Meeting schedule is approved. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. All right, so let's confirm. Was that confirmed? Was that Ted? Was that Ted? Tom Rickert seconded. Tom Rickert seconded. Okay, great. All right, so now we have agenda item 5.0, and I think if everyone could mute themselves when you're not talking, because you're not talking. Perfect. Okay, thank you. Now we have the presentation, Moving Will County with Jackie from Civil Tech and Parat from Ginkgo. Take it away, folks.
Thank you. As we're pulling up the slides, I'm Jackie Hendrickson. I'm with Civil Tech, and we are the consultant lead on the Moving Will County project. And we're working on this with Ginkgo. They're leading the land use effort, and CDM Smith, they're leading the truck routing study, and Lakota's doing engagement, and Valerie Kretschmer Associates has done a market study. And we are doing this project for Will County in conjunction with CMAP. So I am going to give, once we get the slides up, I'm going to do a quick run through an overview of the project and just truck routing recommendations before handing it over to. And I see a lot of faces and names, so I think some of the names came somewhere. And also there's an echo in the background. I think somebody might still need to mute. Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, am I advanced? Okay, great, thanks. So yeah, so these are some just general overview points. So basically, we are hoping to build on recommendations from previous planning studies, such as the Will County Community Friendly Freight Mobility Plan and On to 2050. So in that Will County plan, there was a recommendation to develop a truck routing network and strategies to minimize the impacts of truck routing. So with this study, we are hoping to provide a connected truck route network that makes sense through the communities and is consensus built. We're also identifying strategies to avoid and minimize and, if necessary, to mitigate the impacts of freight. And then we're also, with both of these strategies, we are looking to achieve a balance between economic development, natural resources protection, multimodal connections, congestion relief, and quality of life and mobility. And in Civil Tech, we're basically looking at melding the land use and the truck routing pieces together. Next slide, please. So this is an overview of the study area here. So both the truck routing and the land use have different boundaries, as you can see. So the land use portion, which we're going to primarily talk about today, is concentrated in the south. And this area has a lot of different natural resources to protect. But then there are also a lot of freight generating resource developments as well. And so we're looking at achieving a balance between those two. And then the truck routing study area extends further to the north to account for more north-south connections to interstates. Next, thanks. So just to give a brief overview of the plan process timeline. So both are separate studies, but we're doing them concurrently as they both of the issues, it makes sense to develop recommendations at the same time. So the truck routing study is due to be complete this coming spring. And then the land use strategy, that is on a longer timeline. So that will be this fall. But we've done resource sharing between both of the studies, both utilize the same steering committee and the same review group. So since starting the project in November of 2019, we've had 3 steering committee meetings. We still have 1 more to come. And then we also had a public workshop that focused on the truck routing recommendations in the summer. And we are going to have a workshop that is focusing on the land use recommendations, which we're in the midst of developing this coming winter. And the project is due to be complete, as I mentioned, in fall of 2021. With adoption or policy acceptance in October of 2021. Next slide, please. So just to give a quick overview of the draft truck routing recommendations. So basically, in that Will County Community friendly freight mobility plan, it was identified that there was a lack of continuous system of designated truck routes. And this is causing a lot of issues due to safety and quality of life. And the idea here is that by basically formally designating and letting truck drivers know through the truck routing system where the communities want them to go, it's going to avoid a lot of those issues. It's going to be less of a free-for-all, and trucks are going to be guided through the GPS system on where to go. And the idea is that there's going to be an interconnected network of trucks that connects to major trip generators, gets the trucks off of more local residential or other roads where there are resources to protect, and onto roadways that the communities prefer them to be on. So this is just very high level. I know it's probably hard to see this map. It's a lot and it's tiny, but basically what I'm trying to highlight is that there is an interconnected system throughout the study area. So the map shows existing class 1 and 2 truck routes, and then it also shows proposed short-term class 2, and those are ones that can be implemented in the short term, so under 5 years. And then the long term would require more investment, and those would be beyond the next 5 years. And then a lot of that goldenrod color, those are roadways where trucks are not preferred. So these would be either undesignated or restricted to trucks. And these are roadways that communities can look at closer to determine if they want to designate that as a restriction. We also had some other route types, such as conceptual alignment for projects that are in the works, and then also scheduled for construction. And there were a few roadways where, or actually one specifically, where it wasn't clear at this point what the preferred recommendation is. So at this point, it's still undetermined. And now I will hand it over to Zarian.
Thanks, guys. Can I share my screen so it'll be easier to progress?
Sure, just 1 second. Okay.
Thank you. Can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
All right. Thank you, everyone. I'm Farhat Zareen. I'm the principal of Ginkgo, and I also have Perry from our team here. As Jackie mentioned, we are leading the land use portion of this study. And today we've done, this is a massive project. We've done extensive work with the team. And before we start, I actually wanted to really thank the entire CMAP team for all the assistance through this effort, as well as I see Stacy here from Open Lands and the Forest Preserve District. We see Andrew on the team on the call also, and all the other agencies really helping us handle this extremely large area. So if you can see the screen, we'll show you today where we are. We won't dwell too much on the extensive amount of existing resource and analysis that's been done, but really focus on where we are today. We are very excited. As Jackie mentioned, we just had another steering committee meeting, and we heard very strong consensus, or a start of a consensus, on really some of the preservation issues. So as you can see, the study area is really large. And we are not only looking at a large portion of the Will County, this part of Will County, but quite a lot of municipalities. We have, you know, between Joliet, Elwood, and Manhattan, and quite a lot of other municipalities. But we also, as you can see, there's a ton of white area within this study area, and that's all unincorporated. So we have not only local municipal ordinances, we have county ordinances, a lot of dated ordinances, and there's no consensus or a consistent approach in terms of preservation on land use. So this is a great opportunity to really look at all of that. We've, of course, as we said, done a lot of analysis on not only the existing uses, but as you can see, the general lay of this land is there's a ton of agricultural land that you can see in pale green that hasn't been touched yet. As you all know, the Medavin National Tallgrass Prairie is a major anchor, not only for the study area, but for, our larger region. And as you can see in purple, there's a major emerging regional superclusters of freight-related uses. And we've got two major intermodals here shown in dark purple, where we have the my cursor, and not only along I-80 and I-55, but now with some of the other truck routes that Jackie showed, there's quite a lot of push for major large-scale freight-related uses coming here. So this is a great opportunity between all the communities and the county to really have an understanding of where they should go and what to protect. As I mentioned, there are of course a lot of comprehensive plans from the local communities as well as the county, and some of them are more recent, some of them are old, and many of them do not really take into account the massive growth that is happening so quickly in the freight-related industry. So we are kind of looking at what's there, what all these other plans are, building on them, but there are also some really big issues in terms of who has jurisdiction over what. One of the key areas, as you can see highlighted in dotted lines here, is kind of right now unclear in terms of who that area is going to go to. There's some annexation issues going on, and many of you may be well aware, there's some major push from large development that's happening in an area that generally is farming and hasn't seen much development. So we're trying to understand all of these dynamics, but then just a little bit of an overview of what's there today. Many of you are very familiar with the amazing natural resources that exist here. We are primarily focusing a lot on the watersheds because we've looked at everything from archaeological resources, carbon footprints and all of that. But in general, it really seems that most of the natural resources really follow the waterways and the floodplains. And so while we're looking at all of that, today we're going to focus a bit more on kind of the wetlands, the waterways, and the floodplains related to some of these major watersheds. So here you see kind of a little bit of a gobbledygook diagram, hard to understand, but it kind of shows how much there is there, how much water resources, wetlands, existing greens, bird habitats. And so many of these are building on a ton of resources that have been shared with us, previous plans that CMAP has done, IDNR has done, many of the forest preserve plans. And so there's many layers here, but today we just thought we'd show you one snapshot. And as you can see, not only that, we're looking at generational farms. You can see in yellow some of the generational farms that are there, historic structures, as I said, archaeological resources and all of that. So what we did was we took all of that, and now, one of the things we understood was there's no lack of plans that have identified what should be preserved, but there's perhaps not so much work that has been done on, well, how do you pick from all of that? Which ones should you preserve, and who will preserve it? So one of the first things we're trying to do is establish a consistent set of criteria. So instead of just keep looking for more and more places to preserve, we're hoping that within the county and the local municipalities, there's some kind of consistency in terms of what should be preserved. Here again, we didn't start from scratch. The county in their long-range management plan had a fairly well, nicely put together set of criteria. We used that, but the unfortunate thing is that criteria seems not to have had much implementation or has not been used as much. Then we have been working with many of our stakeholders. The Forest Preserve provided some amazing criteria. So between those and other resources we had, this is a draft kind of combined set of criteria, and it shows everything from connectivity, open spaces, site conditions, many different things that we've heard from everyone. And we hope that once this is finalized, this hopefully can be adopted by the county and by the local municipalities to have one consistent set of criteria for preservation. On the right, you see some areas that have all these check marks, so we'll go to that next. As part of a draft preservation plan, we have selected these 7 areas based on stakeholder feedback as a starting point to create a preservation plan for this area. And here in this chart, it shows how all of these qualify for some of these criteria. So currently on the screen here, you're seeing the draft preservation plan that we have. And as we said, we just submitted to this and showed it to the steering committee and went through quite an extensive survey process. We're getting very good feedback from people who've taken the survey to date, and there seems to be very strong support for majority of these. So these 6 we'll walk you through really quickly. There's, again, we're just showing you one slide per each one of these. The first one is the Joliet Army Training Area. Just going back to the earlier slide, it's this big green area that's immediately north of the Midhaven. And again, thanks to Open Lands and the Midhaven for all the resources they've shared with us. This was, as many of you know, in 1995, when the federal law was enacted for preserving Midhaven. It was always intended in the long term at some point to be handed over to the Midhaven and be part of the Midhaven. So we are simply formalizing what was law already and what was in the works to make sure that not only the county's plans, but all the local plans reflect that this is kind of once and for all settled as to be preserved in perpetuity as federal public open space. The second one is actually a big one, and we're seeing such support for this. This is going to be so huge for the county and the region. And again, kudos to the Forest Preserve for the amazing work they did. They set the kind of base work for us, and we're building on that. So this is a potential greenway. This is along Jackson Creek. As many of you know, Jackson Creek is one of the most, pristine creek. A lot of IDNR work has been done on habitats and all the water quality issues there. So with this one, we're looking at about 8,000 acres potentially that could be acquired to provide a public greenway that would connect all the way from the Joliet Army Training Area to preserves to the east, and long-term really connect to the Des Plaines River. So this could be an incredible amenity, and we're so happy to see the kind of support we're getting for this. And as you can see in the small inset here, those 3 red areas are showing a CMAP plan that was done earlier that recommended 3 key wetland areas to be preserved. So if we can preserve this greenway, then this would incorporate those 3 areas also. Moving on to some smaller pieces that seem small in kind of, you're looking at such a large area, but actually are pretty significant in terms of the impact they could have. This is about, I think, about a 700-acre area immediately north of the Midhaven. Some acquisition has already happened there between the Midhaven and the forest preserves, and we are trying to make sure that kind of a large area is preserved. It would give us access to the Waponzie Trail, and this was also shown in the local comprehensive plan for Manhattan. So we're building on that. This is a kind of more of an ordinance issue, a larger protection for all our waterways. We have Prairie Creek here, lots of creeks here. And what we are finding is the county has its own ordinance for protection. Most of the local municipalities have varying degrees of ordinances. What we are trying to push here is to have a consistent set of ordinance. We often find developers play communities against each other, saying, oh, I'm going to go there because I don't have to give up 35 feet or 20 feet. So we are really pushing to see if we can create a consistent set of ordinances that everyone can follow and makes it easier to enforce. And then finally, we have 2 more. These are the ones that are relatively new, and kind of we're trying to find our way in terms of what to do here. This was a suggestion from the Midhaven stakeholders group to try and create a buffer around the Midhaven to protect not only the natural resources, but some of the bird habitats from noise issues, other pollution issues, and they're recommending about a 1,200 meter buffer. Now we are trying to find how to move forward on this. There's some really technical issues also. Who would enforce this? What does that buffer mean? Is it a blanket buffer all around, or is it in particular areas? So this one we're going to continue to do some work on and try to find some more precedents for buffers around federal open spaces. And then finally, generational farms. So we are starting primarily focusing with farms that are generational. They don't have any protection right now. The Will County Long Range Management Plan had extensive recommendations on farm protection, and those have not been implemented. So we're really looking at, why weren't they implemented and how can we get those going? But as many of you know, this entire region has amazing prime soil. So as an extension of that, not only generational farms, we are trying to find some real implementable mechanisms to protect farmland, or to make sure that agriculture is seen as strong as an economic resource as some of the other things we're seeing here. So with that, we'll just show you a few slides on the kind of overall land use scenarios. So we kind of took the preservation pieces, and then we now are trying to do this very challenging task of taking the truck routing recommendations and looking at overall land uses. So for that, we have developed 4 scenarios, and we just ran those scenarios, very extensive kind of detail there with the steering committee. And again, we're so delighted with the responses we've had so far. So here we're trying to make sure these scenarios are not some academic scenarios. They're very much focused on actual places. We're trying to make sure that they're dynamic. As the truck routing changes, we can change the scenarios and really find a way to create consensus between kind of the different competing uses here. So in terms of creating a place-based tool, as we said, this is a really large study area. We are primarily looking at these 8, what we're calling opportunity areas. These were identified very early on with all the stakeholders. And these were chosen primarily as areas that are close to areas that have been built up already, where we have the infrastructure, and there's a lot of vacant land, there's a lot of opportunities for preservation, to really understand how do you create some kind of a balanced strategy. We took that and then overlaid, as Jackie mentioned, the draft truck routing, the existing class 1, short-term, long-term, looked at all of that, put all of that together, and found a very complicated system, but it seems to be working, and we'll walk you through just the crux of that. So here we're showing you scenario D, which was the last scenario that we walked everyone through, and it seems to have gotten fairly strong, response, and we'll keep looking at what other people are saying. But right now, just to give you an example, these scenarios, what are we looking at? We put some variables on each of these. So here we kind of looked at, in this case, what would happen if you preserved everything that we showed you earlier, and you put in some rules in terms of what vacant land actually was appropriate for freight-related uses. And we did this exercise from scenario A, which had quite a lot of purple meaning new freight-related uses, to this one, which has probably the least in all the scenarios. But we found that the difference between the yield was still so high. So the bottom line is, what we're finding is that we can have it all, that we can preserve massive amounts of natural resources, but still have quite a lot of land in the right spots to absorb the next generation of freight-related uses, and really make sure that we can focus our truck investments, infrastructure investments over there. So now that we are starting to see consensus on that, we're hopefully going to extend these strategies to the entire study area, looking at areas north of the Mid-Avon, other areas that are primarily farmland now, and we hope we can keep going until the next February session and show those. So as you can see here, just a snapshot of the 4 scenarios. Between A and D, we have maximum freight-related land to minimum, and of course, vice versa for the preservation issues. The difference isn't huge. We're looking at a difference of 4,000 acres between the 2 ranges. So, and that's just for those 8 areas. So I think this is good news. We hope we can continue to build this idea that we can have it all, we can create balance and preserve all these resources, but still have very healthy land for doing all these things. So to end with that, we are trying to have some very high level, hopefully consensus building principles for this plan, building on really the tone that 2050 set. And right now we have these three overarching principles: prosper, nurture, and balance. This idea that prosperity should be for everyone, and prosperity does not always mean freight related. It's prosperity in agricultural uses, ecotourism, all sorts of other things, small towns that are there. And nurture doesn't automatically mean it's nurturing natural resources. We want to nurture archaeological resources, small communities, the historic heritages. And then of course, balance. Balance, we are hoping we can find some implementable consensus building policies that everyone can adopt and we can move forward. So again, thank you for your time, and we look forward to your feedback. But so far, we are excited by where this project is going, given kind of all the controversies and kind of the challenges of the project.
Thank you, Zareen, and thank you, Jackie. Does anyone have any questions, comments, discussion for either of our presenters?
I just wanted to say thank you to both teams for the exemplary work that they've done in really extending themselves to a lot of different demographics to try to collect a lot of insight and history and understanding of the communities, as well as the uses and needs, to complement everything in an area that has exploded in potential and growth and use beyond what was expected when the Joliet Arsenal was divided. It's kind of a cautionary tale of a success story. I do have a couple of comments. That the natural resource analysis is robust and wonderful. We are starting to see a little bit of pressure from a few local people on the Midewin buffer. I would state that this buffer is grounded in science, which is such a wonderful thing to see. This is not something that was just arbitrarily put down, but the 0.75 acre buffer was defined out of a midline study, Foreman. It's not the most conservative or the most liberal. It's actually the most well used by transportation analysts to determine exactly what the range would be to protect in order to avoid a constructive use of the federal land under Section 4 of the U.S. Department of Transportation Act. So there is a lot of scientific study about birds, light, noise, vibration, and pollution, which it accounts for specifically, and it applies specifically to this type of landscape. So I think that buffer is really nicely grounded in science. I think it's also important to note that this is not breaking ground to have agricultural buffer, especially one that doesn't necessarily prescribe how it's going to be preserved. Kane County's 2030 plan, that's 2030, not 2050, has a 50-50-50 perspective in it, which utilizes agriculture as a buffer. There are certain aspects to that recognize the need for graded use as a way to protect all uses that are valued within the county. So I think surely with today's planning, even though I know that some people would like to leave this open, especially hearing from the village of Elwood in particular, in which this area is situated, that the residents are speaking in Elwood and the village of Elwood itself feels that it's appropriate as a buffer, I would hope there would remain support. There are a couple of other things, but I've spoken long, so.
Thanks, Stacey.
And I apologize, I didn't realize I wasn't on full mode. My apologies, I just saw your text, Brian, so full mode now.
Okay, no problem. Other questions or comments? All right. Well, hearing none, thank you very much for your presentation today. Really interesting and informative, and certainly hopefully impactful on the future of the Will County region. So thank you so much to both of you. So next up on our agenda then is climate initiatives, and we've got CMAP staff Martin, Nora, and Jason to talk us through some of the climate work plan projects that are happening.
Yes, good morning. Nice to see you all today. I'm Nora Beck. I'm a senior planner here at CMAP. Following onto 2050, CMAP designated climate mitigation and adaptation work as a major area of our implementation of the plan. And this morning, we'd like to provide you with an update on two of our initiatives that we've been working on this year. Kate, it looks like I can advance the slides?
Yes, go for it.
Okay. Do I know how to do that? There, okay, I think it worked. So we've presented to you guys a couple of times now. These are our 5 major areas of work for this year. And so we want to give you an update on the first 2, our climate multi-year implementation planning efforts, and I'll give you that update. And then our transportation mitigation strategies, Martin will present on those materials. So without further ado, let's get into the Kate, I don't know if I know how to advance the slides.
Okay, I'll take over.
Sorry.
That's okay.
All right, so yeah, then and you could go to the next slide too. So our purpose of the climate multi-year implementation plan is to develop a work plan for CMAP for the next 3 to 5 years that maps out our strategy for implementing climate-related ONTO 2050 recommendations. So in order to do that, we've been exploring and building a better understanding of our agency's role in this effort. We need to identify specific and strategic projects that can help us move forward and actually make some progress on our recommendations. And we also need to make sure that our strategies are integrating equity considerations in all of our work. Next slide. Our scope has been pretty simple. We've got five major steps, and we've completed the first 2. So we have held a number of stakeholder discussions, and I'm going to highlight some lessons that we learned from that effort. We've also been reviewing what our peer MPOs and other similarly sized regional governments are doing across the nation, and we have some major findings from that as well. And we're just launching into our 3rd stage, which is to identify and prioritize a potential project list. And I'll step through how we're approaching that. And then as we get a good brainstorm of projects together, we're going to have to winnow them down. We have to make some hard choices about what we can actually achieve and what will be the most impactful in the region. And then we'll be drafting that multi-year list of projects for us to schedule out over the next 3 to 5 years. Next slide. So some of our major findings from our stakeholder discussions, and a big shout out to those of you who helped us and participated in these interviews. We interviewed about 22 organizations, so sometimes there were multiple people on our calls. And we learned a lot along the way. So we saw a lot more action than we previously were aware of on stationary energy and building decarbonization efforts. So that was really exciting. Many of our stakeholders identified transportation mitigation as a major area of work that needs additional efforts, including paying attention to the equity considerations of those strategies. Continuing on that theme of transportation mitigation, a lot of our stakeholders talked a lot about electrification, and we heard a little bit less on efforts to shift people to different modes or use travel demand management or other land use techniques to reduce transportation mitigation or transportation emissions. Sorry. Along the way, we recognized that we needed to reach out to the equity community for a fuller perspective, and so we'll be figuring out a strategy for that. Many stakeholders also recognize that a lot of local implementers are short on resources, knowledge, data, and/or guidance, and just called attention to that issue. And then some stakeholders felt that there currently is not a local champion. In the past, people saw local champions in a strong mayoral presence on this issue, but we don't have that at the right, the sense is that we don't have that at the moment. Next slide. We also asked our stakeholders what they thought CMAP's role should be in this sphere. Many stakeholders identified regional coordination as a function that CMAP could provide, whether we're convening different groups or facilitating. Maybe there's a regional climate action plan that needs to be developed to help that coordination. Others saw that the transportation sector could really use some prioritization and coordination across the different implementers, really help us figure out what are the strategies that are most effective and how do we get those done. Others saw data monitoring and analysis and information dissemination as really important, whether we're reporting on our progress on regional or municipal greenhouse gas inventories, or just cataloging what's happening with the climate and being a central repository for that information and distribution. Other stakeholders identified the need for local assistance, capacity building, really focusing in on implementation efforts that can help remove barriers to clean energy. Others saw infrastructure and community resilience as a major thrust. And then a few stakeholders mentioned the need to decarbonize our economy, and we're thinking about ways that we could assist with manufacturing or other industrial sectors. All right, next slide. So our effort here with the peer review, just to touch on our purpose, is to gain a better understanding of the existing mitigation and adaptation efforts that are already happening at the regional scale. And our thought here is that potentially the work of other MPOs could spur new ways of doing work here in our region. We reviewed 21 peer organizations, mostly MPOs from large metros all across the US. And along the way, we paid special attention to the different state frameworks that may be inspiring more or less action at the MPO level. We saw a lot of MPOs really focusing on reducing transportation-related emissions, especially those with state-sanctioned or regulated reduction targets, but it doesn't require that level of effort for MPOs to get involved. MPOs are thinking through the different strategies to uncover what is the most effective way to work to reduce emissions, and then transforming their programming criteria or other planning methods to move their regions to reach these goals. We also see peer agencies focusing in on regional climate vulnerability assessments. So these assessments identify at-risk communities and infrastructure. They could be sort of similar to CMAP's flood susceptibility index, but they often focus in on additional impacts like heat or drought, and of course sea level rise. And then in addition to just providing that regional data set, peers are conducting an analysis of what that means to specific infrastructure types, and most commonly to their transportation networks, and then developing strategies to address those vulnerabilities. We do see a smaller subset of MPOs that are also documenting social vulnerabilities along the way, and using those in combination with those physical risks. Greenhouse gas inventories, these were most common at the regional scale, so providing just that regional number, but some of the MPOs are providing this at the local municipal level for incorporation into local climate planning. And the most active MPOs are using those inventories to establish some sector targets. So not just having a regional reduction goal, but breaking it down into transportation and stationary energy and and the other different sectors to monitor performance. And then we also found a fair number of MPOs that were working on building decarbonization. So these efforts were happening around retrofits of existing building stock or removing zoning barriers to constructing net zero buildings. I suspect that these are most common in MPOs that are not actively working in transportation efforts. So in particular, MPOs that are where the regional emissions profile has a lot of emissions coming from the building or from the stationary sector. The next slide highlights some of a bit more on the process side. So we see a lot of MPOs are able to expand their impact by partnering with local nonprofits, academic institutions, and government agencies. So for example, an MPO can partner with a local utility or an energy nonprofit to form a partnership to do energy audits, planning, and retrofit, where the MPO just does one piece of that work, but it enables their participation helps build out that portfolio. And then resource sharing. This is a really common role for MPOs to play in the region, helping to distribute priority actions and tools that could help local partners. And then the resources can come in many different forms, and they're not always authored by the MPO, but rather they provide sort of a curated list of critical tools developed by national and local experts. So next slide. So that was just a quick summary of where we've been, and now we're launching into a next phase of work to identify and prioritize projects. And so our goal here is to really hone in on critical achievable actions that CMAP can take in the next 3 to 5 years that help us advance those broader goals of climate mitigation and adaptation identified in ON2 2050. Next slide. So earlier this spring, we worked with Daylight, with Lyndon Belicenti from Daylight, to really explore the climate focus area. And through that process, staff identified some priority ON2 2050 strategies that they see potential for CMAP to play a role in advancing. And so I want to just step through these strategies fairly quickly. And these are directly from ON2 2050. Most of them are from the environment chapter, but not always. The first one is to transform transportation systems to reduce emissions. The next is to incorporate climate resilience and adaptation into planning and development. The third is to strengthen gray and green infrastructure to withstand climate change. Fourth is to explore a regional climate resilience platform to coordinate initiatives and provide data and resources. Fifth is to enhance economic innovation, and this could include reducing our reliance on fossil fuels. And then we have another goal is to address environmental challenges that disproportionately affect specific populations in disinvested areas. And then finally, to comprehensively address energy and climate change at the federal and state levels. So this is a pretty big sweep of strategies that would help us with climate mitigation and adaptation. Our next task is to hone in on these and transform them into a 3 to 5 year, what can we achieve in each of these areas in 3 to 5 years, and what is the process for getting there. So we've divided into small groups, and we're currently exploring our options for 3 to 5 year goals. And I should say that we've divided into groups in the first set of strategies. We've left the last one to comprehensively address energy and climate change at the federal and state levels for last, because we know we're going to uncover potential areas of work in the above strategies that relate to state and federal work. So to give you an example of how we can transform these really large goals into 3 to 5 year intermediate ones, I want to step you through the next slide, which takes that transform transportation systems to reduce emissions and tries to narrow it into something that we could do in the next 3 to 5 years. So these are options, and we're still trying to figure out the process and how far we could get and develop consensus internally on these, but they give you a flavor for the types of things we're thinking about. Develop a regional transportation emissions mitigation plan that would include commitments from transportation partners. Could be an example of a 3 to 5 year goal. We could develop a standalone freight and truck mitigation plan. We could update CMAP's transportation programming process to actively reduce transportation emissions year over year. Or we could develop what Jason has been calling an ELVIS, an electric vehicle infrastructure strategy. So we're still processing through these and trying to figure out what would be the best fit. And we're doing this for each one of those ON2 2050 priority strategies that I just stepped through. And hopefully we're going to uncover some synergies between these different things, and that really helps us identify where our priorities should be. In the next slide, I've got some questions for you, and I'm just hoping to get your reaction on where we are to date. Where should CMAP be in 2025 on climate mitigation and adaptation work? Are there specific strategies from ON2 2050 that we should focus in on? And I'm really interested in that list that I presented before, if you think we should really focus in on just a subset of those. And then are you aware of any synergies with federal or state initiatives underway that we should be really paying attention to? So with that, I'll turn it over to you all, and I hope to get some good answers to these hard questions.
Thanks, Nora. I really appreciate it. What questions, comments, discussion do folks have on these key questions that Nora's posing to us?
I'm sorry, I have to go shortly, so if I could jump in.
Sure, go ahead, Stacey.
I have a family emergency that I have to take care of. I think that the list was excellent, Nora. There's feedback, I'm sorry.
Could everyone mute themselves when they're not speaking?
Unmuted.
Thanks. So the one thing that I'm wondering about as far as green infrastructure in gray and looking at climate mitigation strategies, if you're looking at any synergies with federal or state initiatives, you have these macro sites like Hackmatack and Midewin as far as nature-based solutions that complement agriculture. And with regenerative practices in play is one of the #1 things that we could do in our state to mitigate climate change, as well as these wonderful carbon sinks that we have that we're building and are at our disposal. I'd like to see how places like Hackmatack that have exposure to 10 million people could be, we could work with CMAP on evaluating how those are basically a Midwest solution or an adaptation strategy. So I think that some of the nature-based solutions could be basically justified on the ground with the amount that we have and with the focuses that we have in the plan. Thanks.
Thanks, Stacey. Other comments or questions?
Yeah, I'm gonna jump on what Stacey was saying about the regenerative agriculture. At the Department of Natural Resources, that's one of the things that we're looking at. We own a lot of agricultural land, and we're promoting that regenerative agriculture aspect of things. So I think that is a critical thing that we could do as far as state initiatives go, that we could contribute to this cause.
Thanks, Ted.
Hi, it's Jack. I really like the 4, I think, did you have example transportation focus? Those all look really good to me, and thank you. Not something that somebody else is certainly doing or maybe even capable of doing. So those look really good to me. In terms of synergies with, I'm not sure about federal at the moment, but state, on vehicle electrification, there are some things that already exist with, in terms of dollars available. The state, Illinois EPA, is the lead agency for vehicle electrification for state government, and they are, we believe, are updating their plans to invest the Volkswagen settlement dollars, which is about $100 million that is not exclusively limited to vehicle electrification, but it could be. And also there was 70 million in the capital bill appropriated for vehicle electrification that Illinois EPA is also figuring out a plan for. So those are dollars that are already appropriated and they're currently being planned. And then in terms of potential things, vehicle electrification is pretty prominent in comprehensive energy legislative conversations, both in terms of it's in the governor's principles and also in the Clean Energy Jobs Act. And then there's a potential sync with that, and Illinois is pretty well suited for manufacturing in this space. We've got a lot of, we have a big automotive industry and automotive supply industry, and so there could be connections to the economic innovation or similar goal that was on an earlier slide.
Thanks, Jack. Some other thoughts I had. I know that one thing, especially you jumping on the electric vehicle or Elvis, which Jason and I love, by the way, nice job. But I think another role that NIPSI, even going back to NIPSI days, and then CMAP has played as well, is sort of like model ordinances and other guidance for municipalities. And I think things like an EV readiness ordinance, and the city just passed one which requires certain size developments, especially residential developments, to actually be EV ready and actually have the conduit in place, for example. I think those types of model ordinances could be really, really helpful across all, not just across electrification, vehicle electrification, but probably across all the strategies. Because I know going back even to the SMC's, Lake County Stormwater's watershed development ordinances, in part based on some of the guidance and model ordinances that NIPSI put together 20 plus years ago. So I think that's a really good, I think, niche that CMAP can play too, is to help these municipalities that don't have necessarily, especially some smaller municipalities that don't have the staff to be able to do this, to actually help work through and make it easy for folks to do that process. Other thoughts, other comments?
So I have one question, I guess, about this. And so the examples here are all related to transportation. And I'm wondering if CMAP chooses, let's say you choose 3 projects to work on over the next 3 to 5 years. Would it make sense to choose projects that address maybe 3 different sectors? So you have like one in each, or does it make more sense to do all transportation? I'm just curious where that comes from.
Yeah, actually, Kate, could you go backwards one slide? So we're exploring different activities in all of these different areas, Martha. But you're right. Like, we're not going to be able to do everything, right? So we're going to have to make some pretty hard choices. So that actually goes back to my first question, or the second question in our discussion questions. Are there specific ON2 2050 strategies that we really should focus in on in our efforts here? So we're hearing from Jack and from Sean and others that transforming transportation systems and connecting with electric vehicle work would be important. But are there other things in here that would be a priority or stand out to you that CMAP has a special role to play in?
I would say the climate resilience piece, certainly. That is not something, the city of Chicago historically with the Chicago Climate Action Plan was a leader on this, but it is not currently, and it's not as much of a focus as it once was, with the exception of our greenhouse gas inventories. So I think that's certainly a place that really no one else is thinking about strategically, certainly across the region, that I think is a really important one that CMAP could focus on and should focus on. And I know you've got it here mentioned on a couple of these items actually focus on.
I think too that.
Yeah, go ahead, Martha.
I think too, maybe for local municipalities, this is really what helps people like me, is any sort of climate project or climate initiative that helps to spur economic development is really helpful. especially in the times right now, you know, because things are tough all around. So I know a lot of these can incorporate that into it, and so there's probably no worry about incorporating that, but that's something that I think is very important right now.
Great, thanks, Martha. Other thoughts, comments, discussion?
Hi, it's Ted again. One of the things that I'm working on is trying to work with schools on curricula that addresses the environmental challenges in basically we're calling it underserved areas for IDNR, and that's basically in minority communities where the environmental effects, where you're going to see climate change affecting those areas more than other areas. So address environmental challenges that disproportionately affect specific populations and disinvested areas. I would suggest like adding something in there about working with the schools and school children and see how they and their parents can make a positive change towards addressing climate change.
Thank you, Ted. Any other thoughts?
Sure.
If I can pipe up, this is Edith Macker with the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus,
Sure.
and I know I'll have a moment to speak, or have some time to speak after this, but just to comment on the approach that CMAP is taking. One, I'm just delighted to hear where CMAP is going and the direction. We've learned a lot by doing this regional climate plan, and I totally endorse the other ideas that were presented in terms of transportation and the land use planning. And very excited about collaborating on electrification. But one thing that has become very obvious to me as I've been working through the climate plan is how good of a job CMAP does in communicating the information that it has. And so just for comparison, when we were doing this regional climate plan, we're uploading a lot of information into this platform, which I'll talk about in a minute. And everything that CMAP had done related to adaptation on flooding and land use was really crystal clear and beautifully presented. When I got to the energy piece, it was really murky, and there isn't any one organizing body that is assembling the information on climate and energy use. It's right now in the hands of the utilities, and lack of state leadership on climate has really led to, I think, just a lack of understanding. And so one of the comments about other MPOs using their voice and their visibility and the collaborative role that they have just to provide access to energy information and climate information, I think would be really valuable. And I think that's something that can guide municipalities from our world. And it's not, there's a lot of programs, as you had said in your research, and finding out what's going on with building energy, but just communicating that is something I think CMAP could help with, and presenting it well in a way that we can understand and plug into.
Thanks, Edith. Any other final comments on what Nora was talking about? And then I think we go to Martin, correct? Okay.
Thanks,
Any other
everyone.
comments?
Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Nora. Appreciate it. All right, let's move on to Martin.
All right, thank you, Nora, and thanks for having me. Go ahead, go to the next slide. So just talking about a sliver sort of what Nora was talking about. One of the things she mentioned several times were transportation mitigation strategies. And just sort of a refresher of why that's important. It's important to CMAP because we care about transportation. That's sort of our bread and butter. It is 29% of the emissions in this region. That's actually, it's the #1 emissions across the country, but we have a lot of heat and things like that in this region that make our stationary energy a little bit higher. But one important thing about transportation is emissions are going in the wrong direction. So we're driving more and we're driving bigger vehicles, while the utilities are shutting down coal plants and building renewables. So
there's a little bit of electric vehicles coming online, but really transportation has been moving in the wrong direction. So big opportunity for us. Next slide here. Purpose of this project is just to start to explore what CMAP and our partners can do with greenhouse gas emissions and start to learn. We're going to explore different strategies, and this will just sort of help us better understand the relative impact of different strategies and things that are recommended in our plans and recommended as best practices. We're also seeing legislation across the country, across the world being passed to help push greenhouse gas emissions down. Those regulations vary all over the country. CMAP would like to anticipate what the legislation could look like if Illinois were to have some, and potentially build some data sets that can inform legislation either at the state or local level to have be most productive. At the end of this project, we're not going to have a detailed analysis of every action we could possibly take, but we hope to have a high-level sense of what the big levers are that we can pull. What are the things that we can impact? How big of an impact do they have? What are the high-level strategies that we can pursue that are sort of related to our work? Next slide. So we are currently on the orange part of this flow diagram. We started out with a literature review and identified hundreds of things that could be done to reduce emissions, from building new BRT lanes to incentives and different things like that. And we kind of grouped these together into higher level strategies that I'm going to show you in a minute. And I'm going to be asking for some feedback on those strategies. We're going to take those strategies and sorry, just stop myself there. So right now we're in the phase of figuring out what those strategies are exactly that we're going to model. We have sort of a draft list, and we're looking for feedback from you. So that's the orange box there. Once we've sort of settled on those strategies, we're going to model them. That's going to generate just tons of data. So we'll model them and then analyze that data. And then finally, we're going to figure out how those sort of connect to CMAP's work. Some of the strategies, or many of the strategies we're looking at, come straight out of Onto 2050. So connecting them to CMAP's work won't be that hard, but we're also going to think about our partners and thinking about some strategies that aren't from 2050 and things like that. Next slide here. We've done exercises like this twice in the past, relatively recently. On the left is a chart from our transit ridership growth study. So this looked at various actions that could be taken to see how big of an impact they had on transit ridership. So pricing parking, adding more buses, making transit more frequent, expanding the system, things like that. And I apologize if the fonts are a little bit hard to read on these, but on the right is a chart from our congestion study we did, looking at, in the same way, various strategies and how they impact congestion. So adding tolls, more people working from home, new technology, improved signals, different things like that. For each of these, we had a high and a low scenario. So for example, we could raise the price of parking a little bit, or we could raise the price of parking a lot. We could build small number of projects or build a large number of projects. And that sort of gives us a sense of where the upper and lower bounds are that you see here. Next slide. All right, so this is my attempt at diagramming our modeling process. I'm not sure how familiar the committee is with our modeling process. We're actually going to be using two models for this project. The first one is our trip-based model that tells us about travel behavior in the region. And then the second, we feed the results of the trip-based model into our EPA moves model. And I just want to talk about these for a minute so the committee can understand sort of the different levers we have available to us to develop scenarios from. So the trip-based model has two primary inputs, the socioeconomic forecast. So this is how many people, how many jobs, where are those people, where are those jobs? And we have forecasts for those every 5 years out to 2050. The second main input is the transportation network. So where are the roads? Where is the transit system? How are those going to change? Where are regionally significant projects? And how much does it cost to use those systems? So are there tolls, the gas, how congested are they? What's their capacity? Things like that. So you can just sort of imagine we can alter any of those inputs that I just listed. From our trip-based model, we get vehicle hours traveled and vehicle speeds. Those are broken down by vehicle type. So trucks, cars, light duty trucks, things like that. And those feed into our moves model that has profiles of each of those vehicles and estimates pollutants for each vehicle type for our region. So that moves model not only calculates greenhouse gas emissions, but is going to tell us about other pollutants that the EPA regulates. So your VOC and your NOx and your PM 2.5. This project primarily comes out of climate focus, but we also think all those other pollutants are important. And if we can reduce those with some of our strategies, that'd be good to know too. So we're gonna keep all that data and analyze that along the way. And I got lost in my notes here. So just to recap, the trip-based model is to understand how much travel is happening and in what form. We take that and put it into the moves model, which is gonna give us sort of our pollution estimates. Each of these models takes about a day, from several hours to a day to run. So to some extent, we want to limit the number of models that we run because it takes a long time to run them, but we want to model all the right scenarios too. So with that, next slide. These are the scenarios that we have come up with that we would like to model. And again, one of the main reasons I'm coming to you today is to get feedback on this, what is missing, and things like that. The scenarios based on how they impact travel are done a little differently. The first column will be run in the trip-based model and moves. Many of these scenarios, many of these scenarios come directly out of Onto 2050. So the first two there, transit RSP or regionally significant projects, and highway RSPs. Those are major projects in the region that are recommended in our long-range plan. Other strategies here come from a lot of different work that's been done. For example, those two studies I mentioned already. We looked at other studies that have been done in other regions. And we know that pricing driving has a major impact on how much people do it. So we have a lot of strategies related to that. Speed harmonization, other studies have shown it does impact greenhouse gases, but also it's a major recommendation from our safety area. So something we want to look at to understand a little better. And then working from home is obviously a major area of interest right now and a big deal. Moving to the next column, these scenarios have sort of a smaller impact on travel behavior, but could have a large impact on emissions. So electrifying vehicles, in particular freight we're interested in, it makes up a large percentage of our emissions relative to the number of vehicles, but also strategies pursued like in California around just requiring more efficient vehicles, and then alternative fuels. There's a variety out there that we know, for example, compressed natural gas doesn't get us to zero necessarily, but could improve how much of an impact does things like that have. And finally, I put this little box on here, things that are sort of on our next to analyze, or things that we're not ignoring. So land use will definitely have a major impact on emissions, but we're sort of tabling that for now and there's so many different ways to analyze land use. We want to sort of refine our strategies there. Air and marine transportation can't really be done in our model, but we know they are pollutants. So, but also CMAP plays sort of a smaller role in those. So we're leaving those for later analysis. We know electric vehicles have to get their electric from somewhere. So the electric source is important, and we're not ignoring that. And we'll just sort of acknowledge that in our analysis. And then the manufacturing process. So where do the vehicles come from? How do we make the roads? Those are all things that are important to our partners and important to CMAP, but are sort of going to be part of future analysis.
Hey, Martin, on the electricity source, you might want to also think about the timing of charging as well, because overnight charging obviously is much more beneficial to the grid and to, there's excess capacity generally overnight. And so that is something I would put in that future analysis as well.
Yeah, definitely. And we do have the ability to look at time of day in our modeling, I guess not for the energy grid, but for when people drive, and some strategies could impact what time of day people are driving. So definitely a tie-in there, something we could build on. And that brings me to my last slide. And before I sort of dig into these questions, I just want to restate, the goal of modeling is not necessarily to find the right answer. The right answer is probably to do all of these strategies. That's what the literature review says. That's what we've found in other studies. Doing all of the above is usually the right answer. But the goal of modeling is just to learn something. So we could have a scenario where we give all roads infinite capacity and eliminate congestion, and we learn something. So don't necessarily constrain your thinking to what is realistic. What are the strategy? What modeling would help us learn something is really sort of the right question to ask at this stage. And I did see a question pop up. Yeah, so how we're going to tax EVs. We haven't quite dug into the details of how each of these is going to be executed. We're just sort of grouping them into high-level strategies, and then we'll have to sort of dig more into the policy and the mechanisms for implementing them later. All right, so ready, just read through these questions real quick and then hopefully hear from you. So what would you like to know about potential paths for reducing greenhouse gas emissions? What are you interested in? Are there other things that are not on our list that you would like to see modeled? what information would you like to see for each strategy examined? So we know we're going to get greenhouse gas emissions. We'll probably look at transit ridership. We'd like to have an equity measure. If anybody has thoughts on an equity measure, that would be good to know. And then all those other pollutants. What sort of information would you like to see come out of this? And then do you sort of have a favorite strategy? And what data would you need to support that strategy, or what data could CMAP put out there that would help you or help the region that you'd like to see? So I'll stop for a second. Happy to take any questions about modeling or hear your thoughts.
I'll just jump in first, Martin. I think on the kind of regionally significant project perspective that you had on the previous slide, I think it was, and kind of the land use, which I know is a little more amorphous at this point. I think freight as a regionally significant project is something that should absolutely be on the list. And I know it's not a trip-based model, it's actually just an emissions model. But I think that is looking at the existing freight and then and electrification and other ways of alternative fuels in addition to electricity. I think all of those can have benefits as well. Is something probably, especially in the land use, I would highlight if that's something that needs to be on your list to look at, the freight facilities. Because we're seeing Amazon had half dozen new facilities opening in the next, either have opened or will be opening in the next 6 months, and it's just going to get bigger from there.
Yeah, and as part of our Will County freight study, there was a memo about sort of the climate and pollutant impacts of freight. A lot of the strategies around freight you mentioned are fuel related. There are some that are more focused on just where those emissions land and things like that for pollutants. But we do, some of them are harder to model in that sense, but yeah, I think freight is a big deal, especially for this region.
Right.
So we've been thinking about that.
Okay, great. Other comments or questions for Martin?
It's Ted again. Partners in this, Cook County government, City of Chicago has the Good Foods purchasing policy, making sure that they buy locally sourced food. That ties in with freight. Maybe we partner with the Good Foods purchasing policy to see what we can do to encourage more local governments and other governmental bodies to buy into the locally sourced sustainable food sources.
And to kind of add on that, even and broaden it a little bit, I think there's other partners out there like Chicago Area Clean Cities Coalition that I know Tim is part of, and then Sam Bingham from my team runs. I think they're partners you should probably check in with on this topic as well. Certainly, some of the work that Edith does informs a lot of what we're talking about here too. So I'm sure you're talking to Edith, but I would also include talking to CACC as well as being a key partner on this discussion. Great.
All right, thanks.
Any
The
other
one area.
Oh, go ahead.
The one area that I'm really interested in is this increased work from home capacity. Just being in this virus, I think, has forced people to learn pretty quick how to work from home more efficiently. And actually, we find that we can be more productive while we're working at home because you're not interrupted during the course of the day. But then the other thing that I look at is how, obviously how many greenhouse gases are eliminated by more people not commuting every day. I mean, the biggest hurdle I have in the morning now is jumping over the cat when she walks in front of me. So it's not a 40-minute drive each way every day, which is big. But then on the other hand, as people are in their homes more, and we do see more delivery of products to homes, does that really offset the benefit of the people that are working from home? And how will this move forward, because of the increased productivity that people see? Will this be something that we'll see more of in the future? I used to think there's no way I would share my desk. I can't stand that. You know, I want to have my own space in the office, but not so much anymore. I mean, someone can have my office. I don't care. You know, I'd rather go there once or twice a week and I can share an office with someone. So I really think it's going to change the way people work in the future, not just during the rest of the virus pandemic, you know, but I think moving forward, I think it's going to change things.
And I think,
I do think we have to acknowledge that everybody's situation isn't necessarily like that. There's a lot of people with kids running around the house, and yeah, we're not all finding ourselves more productive.
I think another interesting piece that the working from home brings up, which is probably not a transportation issue, but a bigger climate issue, is like myself, for example, my wife and I are both working from home now. So during the winter, when we would have had the heat basically turned off during the day, we're now going to be turning it on during the day, and kind of, so that's a different shift. And quite frankly, my office downtown, which I agree with Martha that I just have a dog here, not kids, so it's easy for me to work. But you know, I would rather not go down there, but it's being heated even though I'm not there. So there's those I think are kind of perhaps unforeseen circumstances or consequences that we might see as part of this move to more working from home as well, and something that's worth looking into. Not a transportation issue specifically, but certainly an issue to think about. Other comments or questions?
I just have one comment. That is, you know, I know this question about shopping behavior has come up, and I know there's been some research and investigation into it, and I personally don't know any of the results, you know, whether it's a net negative or a net positive in terms of emissions. Does anyone else know about any of those studies? Sean or Claire or Martin or anyone else on the?
You know, Jason, I'll look into it. I know I think I saw one recently where supposedly, at least according to the results I saw, it was actually a net positive from a climate perspective, because rather than me going out to all different stores to pick up these things, the things are being delivered in a truck and everyone on my block to, you know, from Amazon. But I'll check in with Sam Bingham on my team too and see what we might have on that, what research he might have done.
Now, if you know, if we could somehow have some sort of rapid fleet conversion of all the delivery vehicles, and I believe Amazon is moving in that direction. Maybe yeah. I've seen some FedEx trucks out there with you know, alternative fuels and so on. So that would really help, you know. But I'm not sure what levers or policies are out there right now that could encourage that switch in the fleet.
Hi, yeah, consider ride sharing for your goods and services.
Right.
Hi, this is Carrie. I have another question. Because things are changing so rapidly, as was brought up with deliveries and commuting and such, what is the process for readjusting the models? I know you've run over that before when people didn't expect rideshare to have such an impact, or autonomous vehicles. What is the process within CMAP when, based on the strategies we already have, and reevaluating based on new information, because this is such a disruption event?
Yeah, so we regularly update our model. Our current model was sort of calibrated to 2015, but we're currently undergoing the process of updating that. We just did a household travel survey last year and have gotten the results of that sort of come in and processed and analyzed, and we're applying those to our travel model, and we'll have an updated model sometime next year. So for this project, we're going to use the 2015 model, and we think that's close enough to give us, you know, an understanding of the relative impact of some of these different strategies. And then once we get the new model that's been recalibrated to sort of our latest data, we'll discuss whether we want to rerun these or sort of look at different strategies or something like that. So.
And that's the behavior model, right, Martin? And the
right.
The MOVES model, the one that estimates emissions and pollutants, actually comes from EPA, and so they make adjustments every, I don't know how frequently, but whether CAFE standards are changing or other things change that are legislative in nature at the federal level, they'll send us an updated model that will change how emissions calculations are done. But I don't think we do much adjustment to the emissions model. Is that right?
No, the vehicles rates of emissions are going to be based on the vehicle. So, if the vehicles are on the street, that's how much they'll be polluting. I do think you have to be pretty cautious in assuming the extent and the duration of impacts on some, based on some strange situation that you find yourself in, like right now. It is going to be a process of wait and see how much things change. We don't know that it's going to be permanent, but we do have ways to try to figure out how to include impacts in our model. Even if we don't have a work at home model, we can make people work at home, in other ways, just to see what the impacts are. So we try to reflect things that we see, when doing testing, even if we don't have a model that's designed for that exact question right now. It's pretty flexible.
Thanks, Claire. Other comments or thoughts on these questions from Martin? All right. Well, thanks, Martin, and thanks, Nora and Jason. Appreciate it. Our final agenda item is the Regional Climate Action Plan, and that's Edith and Jared.
I believe Edith is going to get us started. Are you sharing your screen, Edith?
I was going to, and I think I might have a system preference problem. So that may take more time than we have right now. So I think it'd be fine if we go ahead and ask Kate to help us with the slides. So thank you for sticking with us. Jared and I will tag team this, and I just wanted to thank you. I'll get started while the slides are coming up. Just thank you for the opportunity to present this project and the progress we've made. We did get a chance to talk with you about it. Let's see if I have control about this last January, and then the project has gone very, very quickly. Some of you were involved in some of the workshops that we had as well. So thank you for that. So hopefully it won't all be brand new. So let's see if I have any control, or am I just doing a verbal advanced slides, please? Kate or Brian?
You could use your keyboard, or I can advance. No. There you go.
No. Okay, thank you. With that, so just to recap, so this is a regional climate planning process that we are doing as part of a project called Regional and Metro Scale Climate Leaders Project, and we are cooperating with a group called with the European Union and their program called International Urban Cooperation, which did a call for projects starting last spring of 2019. We competed with other regions to be selected as a member of this pilot cohort for working together on regional climate planning. The purpose of the project was to demonstrate how regional climate planning could work in the US, and then to really engage better with the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy platform, which engages both 10,000 municipalities around the world as well as regions. And so regional climate planning is very strong in Europe and in other parts of the country. This brings it to the US. So it was a fast-paced project. And then if you would tap, there's just one additional animation on this slide. So as being a part of this project got us collaboration with the other regions that you can see on the map there. The Chicago region is the largest, and I will say that we probably had most in common with the Kansas City region, just in terms of the pace that we had to get our work done and where they were at in terms of climate planning for their organization. In Kansas and Metro Washington, there were also MPOs, councils of governments, that were involved in this one. And what we got as part of the participation was support from an engineering company, Burrow Happold, that was provided to all of the regions cooperating in the pilot study. And we learned together in the US, as well as working with other regions in the world, on how to adapt everything that was out there into a regional scope. Next slide, please. And so the requirements of this project, Global Covenant of Mayors is a long-term commitment, and that formal commitment was made by the Metropolitan Mayors Caucus Executive Board. So we are the organization that is responsible for all of these. And if you'll tap the slide, you'll see the steps there. There are 7 tasks that we have already completed, this in just over a year. And we were really building on the work that CMAP had done, really to just accelerate our progress in meeting these objectives. And you'll see as we go through the slides quickly how this ties into the action. So I won't spend a lot of time on that. The step we're on right now is pulling everything together into the Climate Action Plan, which includes both mitigation and adaptation. And then on an ongoing basis, Mayor's Caucus will be utilizing a common reporting framework. Next slide, please. So just an overview of what the mitigation portion of the plan will look like. There's a goal, and Jared will talk more about how that target was set. Overall goal is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 80% by 2050 over the 2005 levels. And mitigation includes actions that directly reduce greenhouse gas emissions or supportive actions. And these are in the sectors of energy, transportation, and waste, with land management and other supportive strategies included. Next slide, please. Jared, your turn.
Yep. All right. So I'm going to spend the next few minutes walking you through the mitigation side of the plan. I've already presented this information to the committee 3 or 4 times, so I won't go into too much detail, though you're welcome to ask questions if you'd like more clarifications. But in order to set up the recommendations, it is helpful to still review where we are today. And the slide you see on your screen right now is the most recent greenhouse gas emissions information that we have for the region. That comes from our 2015 inventory, which seems pretty out of date today, but you can't start an inventory for a year until a year or so after that year passes. So it's not wildly out of date. But the really high-level finding from this inventory was that roughly 2/3 of our region's emissions are coming from buildings. But the chart you're seeing right here actually breaks things down a little bit further. We're looking at subsectors. And when you break things down that way, we see that there are 3 big pieces of the pie that are each accountable for roughly 1/4 of our emissions. Those are residential buildings, commercial and institutional buildings, and on-road transportation, which includes public and private cars, buses, and trucks. The next biggest chunk of the pie is manufacturing, which is 17% of the region's total, and everything else is fairly small, 4% or less. Finally, there are things that we know produce emissions but are not included in our inventory, and that has to do with the methodology that we use. So we're not looking at things like land use changes or most aviation, and those are both pretty consequential. Also, agriculture is not included. Next slide, please. As part of our 2015 inventory, we also asked our consultants to do a quick trends analysis to see how things had changed between 2010 and 2015. During that period, the region saw a 7% absolute reduction in emissions and an 8.5% per capita reduction in emissions. On the left, you can see a little bit more detail about where those reductions occurred. Notably, buildings saw an 8% reduction. That was the biggest in absolute terms. That was mostly from having a cleaner grid. So we were burning less coal, using more natural gas and solar. And as Martin already mentioned, transportation saw a 1% increase. And that's really critical because that's something we see not just in our region, but in regions across the country. Transportation emissions are driven by long-term public and private investments. So on the public side, that's development patterns and highway investments. And on the private side, you're looking at personal automobiles, which can cost $30,000 and last for 10, 15 years or more. So it's really hard to move the dial on that. Next slide, please. An 80% overall reduction, Edith already mentioned, that's our overall baseline kind of minimum target that we're shooting for. And we really do emphasize that this is the floor and not the ceiling. And that's because of the way we do our emissions inventory. So we're not looking at net emissions. We are including recommendations for things like carbon sequestration and nature-based solutions to absorb the carbon that's in the air, but we don't measure that. So we know that if we hit an 80% target in terms of absolute reductions, our net emissions reductions are going to be even higher than that. And that 80% target, I should say, is consistent with GO to 2040, On to 2050, Illinois' target, and the Paris Agreement. And it's generally considered to be the minimum action that's necessary to avoid some of the most catastrophic effects of climate change. So the right side of the screen, if you go back for one moment, Kate, we asked our consultants to help us figure out exactly how we could possibly hit that target, because we know that not all emissions reductions are created equal, and trying to get a uniform 80% reduction might not work, and it might not be the most efficient path to getting there. So we dug in a little bit deeper, and with the help of our consultants, our draft goal was to have an 86% reduction in building energy. That's, again, our biggest chunk of the pie. That's where most of our emissions are. And it's a sector that we can move relatively easily because a lot of the factors are not on the consumer end. You can update, you can change the way that you're generating electricity. You can incentivize different programs to have more efficient buildings. Transportation, we are targeting a 60% reduction. That's obviously less than 80%, but that would still be unprecedented for our region. So it is very ambitious. Waste was a 74% reduction, which has to do with it being a relatively small piece of our region's emissions and having already picked a lot of that low-hanging fruit. I should mention that a lot of the things that we think of as being big contributors to waste emissions are actually in other buckets, the way that we currently do our inventory. So garbage trucks and recycling plants, those would fall into transportation and building energy, respectively. Next slide, please. All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Edith for this one.
So we started this project a year ago in October with a workshop, in-person workshop, to start determining priority strategies. We use the Greenest Region Compact framework from which to pull strategies, and used stakeholder participation to help prioritize and evaluate those. If anyone is not familiar with the Greenest Region Compact, it is a sustainability pledge for municipalities, as well as the framework is a long list of more than 300 strategies that themselves are drawn from municipal, regional, and national plans that are focused for municipal action. So in itself, it's a big compilation. The idea is to revisit those strategies and fine-tune them, prioritize them for climate action. This is just a snip from the mobility page that we were looking at. So next slide.
All right, so once we had done the initial research to figure out where we were, identified some possible recommendations, and then conducted some workshops to figure out which of those recommendations were most relevant to our region, the next step was to figure out at what scale those recommendations would need to be implemented for us to hit our target. And to do that, we use the CURB tool, which you can see on your screen here. The CURB tool is a free online tool developed by C40 cities that's intended to help communities model out emission scenario to hit their reduction targets. It should be mentioned that this tool was created by an organization that works with cities for cities. So it's not a one-for-one match with our region. Edith mentioned this is a pilot project. We're trying to figure out how we can use existing tools at the regional scale. So there are places where we're kind of comparing apples to oranges here, but it was still very helpful. So with that caveat in mind, what you're looking at is which, for our total reductions, where which sector the reductions are coming in. The big chunk that you see in yellow, the biggest piece of the pie, is coming from having a renewable grid. So as we were gaming out scenarios, we found that if we want to hit that target, we really need to get as close to 100% renewable grid as possible. If you're not addressing grid energy, you're just not going to get there. The section in orange at the top of the chart is showing building energy, which is coming from increased efficiency and electrification. So that means turning things like furnaces and water heaters into heat pumps, also some in cooking as well. The bottom section is looking at mobility and transportation, and the biggest actions there were simply driving less and electrifying as many vehicles as possible. Next slide, please. So in a moment, Edith is going to walk you through some of the recommendations that we're putting in the plan. But before we get into the details, I think it's worth going over the overall framework that we're using to address mitigation. This is what we call our plain talk outline, because as we are going through this, we realized a lot of the recommendations seem pretty far in the weeds, but it's actually pretty simple. There are two big things that we need to do with emissions, and that's simply use less energy and use cleaner energy. So if we're using less energy, we're really focusing on buildings and on-road emissions. Those are our two biggest sections. And for using cleaner energy, we mean first generating more clean energy through solar and wind, but also importantly, electrifying as many buildings and vehicles as possible to make sure that they can take advantage of the clean electrons that are now in the grid. If you have a clean grid, but you're not using that energy, then you're only going to get so far. And then notably, we have a third section, which isn't quite at that top tier, but is still critical, and that's carbon capture. We know there's already too much carbon in the atmosphere, and we need to do everything we can to get it out. Fortunately, we have one proven really good strategy for doing that, and that's relying on nature. So our recommendations are not looking at industrial scale plants or anything. We're really talking about restoring natural systems, expanding urban forests, and other green infrastructure solutions, which also relate to our adaptation recommendations. So we're focusing on those co-benefits as well. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Edith.
So I'm going to whip through the objectives, and then we're just going to have strategies up on the screen. And I apologize for putting them all up there, but I also didn't think there was a better way to assure you that we haven't left, or so you can see the breadth of it. So just to walk you through what the presentation will look like, and this is not the final presentation form, but this is strategies as very evolved at this point. So note the objective. There are 8 of them in mitigation and similar in adaptation. The strategy below it, these are highly consolidated, just so you know, the range of strategies that we could choose from. There are just so many choices and the level of detail. So we did our very best to consolidate them, but also pull out ones that were of great priority. They do track to the curve tool modeling that Jared just talked about. And so that is reflected in the last column there, which is the GHG potential, reduction potential, and they are clustered and grouped because of the way the greenhouse gas inventory and the reporting and the modeling works. Everything presented here is through the municipal lens. While strategies like decarbonizing the grid or objectives are very high level, it's still presented as what's the municipal role in that. And so there's 3 types of actions that a municipality can take. One is lead their own operations. Enact means that it's a policy that either local or other entity has to undertake for that action to occur, for that reduction to occur. And then encourage can be both a hopeful role for municipalities if it's their constituents, or if it's encouraging others like businesses or other agencies, that is also noted. The reality check is the solution status. And the one to watch for is proven or evolving, meaning we got this, we know how to do it. You'll see some things like aspirational or contingent, and those are red flags, which I'll actually mark as we go through the slides in red. So quick tour, because I am watching the clock here. So Kate, if we could get started on the, oh, and just to point out, each strategy, well, I can't present it on the slides. We have an equity consideration tied to each strategy. And each objective, as well as identifying lead partners for enacting this, and then an estimate of cost and time commitment for implementing those. So you won't see them on the slide, but they'll be in the plan. Okay, so first strategy there, Jared talked about how important the building energy sector is. And then just to flag, look at the green one is building retrofits. We know how to do that. The idea of accelerating electrification for buildings. It's considered aspirational just because we haven't made much progress on that as a region. One more color code that you'll see on the slides is the blue strategies. These are either stated in onto 2050, the Greenest Region Compact, or there's initiatives that are underway. So as I breeze through these, watch the color coding as we move to the next objective. And you'll see the little plain talk bubble there pop up. I credit Jared for that plain talk reality check on everything. So next, please. Energy policies, and you can go ahead and pop up the bubble, Kate. So this is overarching between energy efficiency and clean energy supply, but these are really important policy strategies that need to occur in order to get those reductions. And so one that I'll point to that's hopeful is the last one there, related to adapting zoning codes and streamlining development processes to accelerate solar and other renewable energy. We have some success in that with the SolSmart work that we've done in the region, but one such as the franchise agreements right now is a policy barrier, labeled there in red as contingent, because that's just an obstacle that we are not able to overcome at the local level yet to advance renewable energy systems. So next slide, please. And then this is the tough one that Jared was talking about on the CURB tool. This is absolutely essential, is to provide cleaner energy. And that is something that is so dependent on the utilities and the grid. Very, very important that we do that. One area that we do see we have some influence, and it should be, I think it's a high GHG potential there, is engaging the community in choosing clean energy. So driving the market for clean energy is helpful, but some of these ideas like a cleaner grid and district energy solutions for are challenging, but priority areas that need focus. Next slide, please. Transportation, so this is cleaner energy side. This relates to less fuel and cleaner fuel, and there's a lot of discussion here on electrification as well as fuel efficiency, and this is again because of the way the modeling works. Next slide, please. Reduce VMTs, driving less, and this is familiar turf in terms of land use decisions, so transit-oriented development and active transportation, and then real underscoring the importance of transit. Next slide, please. Manage waste sustainably. This is a small contributor. I'm just going to breeze over that, but there is some hope here just in terms of changing consumption behaviors and looking at composting. And the next slide, please. We just split this out last week when we were putting these strategies together. So we're working on pulling water systems out. It's a relatively small contributor, but again, familiar priorities related to efficient delivery of drinking water and efficient management of wastewater. Our priorities, relatively low contributors, but we're working this into the plan right now just to see where that overlaps with the waste category as modeled. Next slide, please. This very generally, that's okay, you can go quickly because we're running low on time. Everything that local government is doing to demonstrate sustainability, keep doing it. That's the one here. And this was a late win for natural-based systems, is that we are able to use some work that was done by the Forest Service and the Arboretum about 10 years ago to model sequestration benefits of the urban forest. Next slide, please. So on the adaptation side, just an overview here. The strategy for this was different. So we didn't actually start with the Greenest Region Compact strategies. We started with the climate risk and vulnerability assessment that was done as part of our project by the Borough Happold team. But we also had engagement online to come up with hazard impact pairs, and we're working with NOAA and their steps to resilience. So this was the recommendation, is that we lead with these hazard impact pairs, and the hazard is flooding, the impact is on infrastructure. And we organized our objectives around that. So the goal here, there is a prompt. We're still looking for help in phrasing this, but right now the goal is to lead with resilience. It's hard for us, if not impossible for us, to have a metric-based goal just because we don't have enough information. This is an early goal, so if you have a better goal than lead with resilience, please put it in the chat and we welcome those suggestions. But the hazard impact pairs there, again, by priorities, relate to heat, everything related to flooding, and then an additional category looks at air pollution and public health. The adaptation side is where we, I think, do a very good job of integrating equity in all the approaches. And then around these hazard impact pairs, we have our adaptation objectives. So next slide, please.
Edith, I hate to do this when there's so much good material to come, but with just a few minutes left in the meeting, I wonder if we might want to invite discussion now.
Sure. I think that's a fine place to stop. So there's lots more details, and thank you for letting us get through that.
No, thanks very much.
Comments, questions, discussion?
Edith, do you have specific discussion questions that you had prepared?
The feedback was, I guess, on some things that I'm really struggling with that I would like some feedback on is the scale and the focus that it seems, and Jared hinted at this a little bit when we were talking about the curve tool modeling. So much of our what we see and the tools that we have are focused on municipal scale, but as a regional plan, and obviously this, there's a lot of strength here in regional collaboration and addressing systems that function regionally. So does anybody else sense any discomfort sort of going back and forth between the local and the regional scale would be one discussion point that I'd like some guidance on.
So maybe it's cheating for me to answer that question since I've been working on the project. But one thing that I thought has been really helpful as somebody who often approaches things at a regional perspective, drilling into the municipal level has allowed me to see what municipalities can do to address these issues, and then also what they can't do. So in the future, I think we'll be able to take some of those lessons learned and do projects that do address things more at the regional scale and build on this like more focused approach. At least that's how I've personally been thinking about it.
It also seems to me that one of the problems between regional and local is the competition between municipalities for, economic development and all that stuff. So there are some really good things probably that local governments can do. And yet if all the local governments aren't doing them, some municipalities might feel disadvantaged by them. So there's a pretty good link between the regional and the local for some topics like that. A lot of, yeah, I'll just stop there.
Okay. Any other final comments or questions?
Just in closing, we are looking to, we've got the strategies in place, and then on an ongoing basis, we'll be using that common reporting framework. We have already uploaded and submitted work to Global Covenant of Mayors, so we'll get some feedback on that before the end of the year. But the actual plan, we're looking at pulling together by the end of the year, putting it out for review, and then release either before the holidays or right after.
Great. Thanks for that, Edith. And thank you, Jared, as well. Appreciate it. Any other business?
Hey, Sean, I have one comment or question. So our director, Mike Warner, is retiring in December, and he is the kind of named person as the representative for the Stormwater Management Commission to this committee. And I'm not really sure actually if it's the commission that is named, if it's just a representative from the commission that's named as a member of this commission, or if it's specifically Mike Warner. But I think that would be, I think that, SMC would still be happy to serve on this committee, but obviously with Mike's retirement, we need to kind of move through a replacement process.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. And we can talk about that. It's the named member of the committee is Mike. It's not a institutional seat on it. But yeah, we'd be happy to talk about that. And I'm sorry Mike couldn't be with us today. He's been serving as a member of this committee for a long time, and we really appreciate everything that he has contributed to it. So if you have a chance to pass along our thanks to him, that would be great.
I certainly will do that. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Brian. All right. Any public comment? All right, then our next meeting, as we agreed at the beginning of the agenda, at the beginning of the meeting today, our next meeting will be January 7th, 2021. Oh my God, does that make me feel old? Anyway, hope everyone has a great holiday season. Hopefully the world is at least improving at that point. We'll see what happens. But thank you everyone for participating in the meeting today and over the years. So appreciate it.
That's
I'd
Orthodox
entertain a motion to adjourn. Anyone want to make a motion just as a formality?
Sure, I'll move.
All right, great. Thanks everyone. Have a great holiday season. See ya.
Thanks, Sean.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Great presentations. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.